Before getting into Mr. Caption's Part 2, I would like to elaborate on some issues that I've come across while doing some additional research. As to why the Brotherhood members didn't have T-51 power armor in Fallout 3, I came across another video from a YouTuber called RadKing that theorized why this was the case in this game.
So why are there only 2 suits of T-51 in the game? Why has the Brotherhood, who traveled across the continent and likely wore T-51 while still on the West Coast, completely switched over to a new kind of power armor? There's actually no lore reason ever given for the switch, but we can offer a few examples both in and out of game. We know that the Brotherhood found a large stash of T-45 armor at the old Pentagon that they decided to equip their soldiers with during the events of Fallout 3. So it is possible that after trekking across the country, it was easier to switch over to a huge stock of relatively unused T-45 armor than fixing all the T-51 that they had lugged across the continent with little or no supplies. In a similar vein, T-45 may have been simpler. No fancy pants polylamination going on, and therefore T-45 is easier to repair, which is better for the Brotherhood as they grapple with firmly establishing themselves in the capital wasteland.
In addition to this, I found a huge logic error in Mr. Caption's critique. To confirm this, I wanted to go over the Fallout Bible, which is really how I came to find RadKing's channel. And why I haven't gone over everything in the lore or even in the Bible. I've at least skimmed it to get a better understanding of the background and lore. Now, I don't think I have to do this to counter certain claims, and I am trying to get the greatest understanding of everything Fallout has to offer. If I'm missing any key relevant lore or information, please feel free to use the comment section below to let me know what information I'm missing and where I can find it. There seems to be 2 major flaws in Mr. Caption's critique. The first is that the NCR Brotherhood War was not established in Fallout lore or background until Fallout New Vegas. To remind people, Fallout New Vegas came out about 2 years after and wasn't even in development until Fallout 3 was finished. The Brotherhood of Steel have been struggling for years, both here and back home. That is mentioned by Elder Lines in Fallout 3, and that is the closest I could find to support that there were any plans to have a Brotherhood NCR war at the time of the release of Fallout 3. There's nothing in the Fallout Bible, even if it was still canon, to support that there was any plans for a Brotherhood NCR war. It really seemed like they wanted to keep the future vague so new things could be developed for the Fallout series from pretty much the start, at least from my knowledge of everything I've read. On a side note, the Fallout Bible Entry 9 could hint at why the Maxons had their heir sent off with Elder Lyons' group. But that would just be speculation on my behalf, so I would rather not expand on that idea here. The other logic flaw in Mr. Caption's critique is that there is an example of what the Brotherhood of Steel is doing in Fallout 3 being done before in Fallout Tactics. The Brotherhood of Steel group in Fallout Tactics gets lost, some about an airship, crashes in the Midwest, and pretty much decide to do the same thing as Elder Lyons' group in the Capital Wasteland. They recruit members from the locals into their ranks and start developing relationship with the locals, trades, protection, etc. Now, it almost seems like Mr. Caption doesn't consider Fallout Tactics and probably even Fallout Brotherhood of Steel, because both games break away from his and maybe interplays understanding of the Brotherhood of Steel, but it has been done before, so I don't see why he thinks it's so out of character for the Brotherhood of Steel of Fallout 3. Given the established lore, I guess they're just going with the strict creators thingy, majiggy. Now, all of this could have been in the Van Buren design document. I haven't gotten through all of it yet. I've been finding out bits and pieces about it, but since it wasn't mentioned in this particular video and is also external material, I don't think it would really matter if it did. Still something interesting to go through when I have time to search that out. For part 2, Mr. Caption starts with a rant about pretty much the super mutants. Yeah, there's a bit about how he liked Three Dog, despite him getting a little annoying at times. His point about fighting with the super mutant behemoth is fine and all. It might be fairly tough to win at an early level without the Fat Man, but much too easy if you have taken the lessons of Fallout 3 to heart and loot every dead body you can. Still, Mr. Caption has this point that it should have been a boss of like Vault 87, and that's freaking ridiculous. How the hell could have that thing fit into a vault, smushed up in there? It makes me laugh just thinking about it, but he goes on talking about how stupid the super mutants are, and it strikes me again as something someone would say when they didn't think too hard about these super mutants. It seems Mr. Caption thinks these good old super mutants should have been just how they were in the good old days. Bethesda practically flipped the switch on the history of the North American continent in Fallout 3. The West, where farming and fresh water can be found, why the East got nuked into a wasteland where it's pretty hard to get some fresh purified water or any food of any kind. The super mutants of Fallout 3 aren't the same as raiders. I could understand why people believe that, but still. In metaphorical terms, the raiders are the outlaws of the Wild West, why the super mutants are the Indians of that same ancient West thing. Bad comparison, I know, but I was inspired by Mr. Caption to make it. The main point that I'm trying to make is the super mutants of Fallout 3 suffer from the same resource shortages that everyone else of the capital wasteland is dealing with, along with the lack of FEV, one of their resources, to make more of their own kind. Even in Fallout 1, the majority of the super mutants were made under the supervision of Richard Gray, later known as the creature as the Master, who united them together. Even the version of FEV in Fallout 1 wouldn't have been the same as the samples that the scientists were working with in Fallout 3 was a primitive version of FEV and not the version 2 that was developed after the Great War. And even then, the Master modified that FEV version 2 even further to create his super mutant army through trial and error. So that means for Fallout 3, the FEV formula was different. While the super mutants of the East Coast were made by a group of scientists who might have been mad or not, can't confirm that, to basically test the FEV on human and animal subjects. And they didn't seem to have much of a clue with what they were dealing with. Eventually they lost control of their little experiment, and the patients took over the asylum, so to speak. Why this is just my impression of it, I think the super mutants, who were pretty much used as lab rats, sort of soured them the idea of being nice to humans. I mean, even the semi-intelligent ones like Fox and Uncle Ruckus didn't show a particular interest in humanity. It seems like Mr. Caption knows about all this, he just doesn't like it. Which I can understand. He asks why Vault 87? Why, it's fairly obvious to me, having a vault, which would be sort of the perfect test site for experimenting on humans, turning them into super mutants. In fact, that is what happened. Before the war, it was converted into this testing ground. Mr. Caption states that they could have been replaced with anything else. But there is all sorts of problems with this. He doesn't give a reason why they should have replaced them with anything else besides it was horribly uncreative. And it sort of fit in with that reflection of the East Coast versus West Coast. Urban versus rural themes? I really think they were going for this. Did they pull it off? That's a totally different argument to be made. The better question is, how the hell did the Institute get FEV? Sure, there was that scientist who came to Rivet City to track down one of the replicants. It's more unbelievable that he could have gotten a sample of FEV when even the super mutants ran out of it by the time Fallout 3 started. This is definitely more of a stretch than them being in Fallout 3. Mr. Caption calls it a contrivance, but he really doesn't explain what the contrivance is in this. Maybe he's trying to say just having soup mutants or steel bros in the game is a little contrived. But he does not make an argument, at least not a big one, about why it's so important that they shouldn't have been in a sequel game. This might be straw manning him a little bit, but I can understand him not wanting to let dirty Bethesda play with the established lore, but it is right there in the name. Forced evolution virus. Fallout 3 forces the evolution or growth of the Brotherhood and super mutants in a setting that they didn't start out in. In one of those cases, it is for the better, and for the other, for the worse.
But I'm just saying, the super mutants in Fallout 3 didn't have to be super mutants. They could have been anything else. They could have been dog people. I don't care. You could have come up with anything. And again, this isn't the only example of this happening. We'll get into the other example of this happening later on. It's not quite as bad, but it's still pretty After we clear out the National Museum of History, or what the fuck it's called, we go down the road over to the Pencil, also known as the Washington Monument, and we go up an elevator to install Three Dogs' new satellite dish. I actually really like the way Bethesda used their little ranged radio signal thing here. Being able to hear GNR clearly now isn't a particularly amazing gameplay change, but it does allow this quest to have a cool reward that doesn't involve giving the player stats or items or anything. I think personally this is something that more RPGs should do, is give out rewards that aren't, completely based in progressing your character. I get that that's the point of an RPG, but sometimes it can be cool to do something that isn't the point.
This is a very interesting opinion that I approve of. Mr. Caption doesn't think that the side questing was that great because he can't remember much about them. He had both dislikes and likes about the Replicated Man quest. He liked the world in general, art style, tone, and such. Stated no real problems with the Jefferson Memorial, and not even one complaint about how hard it was to figure out where the holotape was. That is the next clue to finding your father. I'm looking at you, Mr. Bomber Guy. Mr. Caption actually liked Vault 112, and even gave it some praise, which is understandable. That is the one place in theory it would really be hard to critique for not being original or doing nothing different. The vaults are definitely, let's just say, interesting in Fallout 3 and gives the game a more menacing tone to Vault Tech. Mr. Caption continues with the main story quest, not really pointing out anything wrong until the introduction of the Enclave. He's really surprised at the number of troops of the Enclave in Fallout 3 because the Chosen One blew them all up, I'm guessing. I didn't know this. The lore doesn't say anything about this from what I could read or find. I mean, I understand thinking why most of the Enclave being at that one base that the Chosen One nuked might have been a possibility, but even so, if that was the case, it would have been extremely stupid and sort of illogical. Yes, I could believe that most of the top brass might be at that station, but I'm pretty sure a highly secured base would be limited to really the best and brightest, or at least the ones the leadership thought it that of. You have the ass kissers who always don't belong in the positions they're in. I'm pretty sure there would be more places and personnel somewhere that were still needed, but not very well thought of by the inner circle. As for the Enclave, I came across a video that sort of addressed this issue.
It also just feels like the Enclave is placed wherever the writers want them and whenever they need a villain on call. Sure, it makes sense that the Enclave could be anywhere. The problem is that each iteration we encounter only seems to enforce the idea that there's no other bases or anything. Fallout 2 really just didn't mention anything about other Enclave bases. Alright, that's fine. It was the first appearance. They didn't know whether they wanted the Enclave to be a recurring faction or not. And hey, the Fallout Bible actually mentions the Enclave retreated around the globe. And then Fallout 3 rocked up. The Fallout Bible was denounced as canon, and we got this amazing line in Fallout 3.
In the decades following the war, I watched as the remnants of the government retreated to the West Coast.
Are you kidding me? Just because Malcolm McDowell sounds amazing when delivering the line doesn't mean you can just get away with that. You're basically saying, Enclave on the continental US? Well, you know that oil rig that blew up on the West Coast? They all fucked off over there ages ago. And then the few survivors came all the way back here. But you know, maybe it could just be the top honchos in the government, like the vice president, and not everyone. Or it might mean the group from Raven Rock left, and not the whole rest of the Enclave.
This was a clip I cut from the Omega Initiative, but as it stated, it's really vague to whether or not the Enclave have any other bases around the US or world practically by design. It's almost as if the Enclave is a shadowy government organization who'll try to do their best to hide their existence. Unless, of course, the existence was found out, then they'll own up to that. But other than that, they're the only group out there and they're the best. Rah, rah, rah. Yeah, it's a rather cheap, open-ended write-in technique that was used on them, but that seems to be how they were written from their very introduction into the series until now. His next point, something about worse power armor. Again, the lore really doesn't say much on that. The whole armor system was sort of redesigned and balanced differently. Who knows if that's true? Even if that is the case, I really don't know why it should matter. So I'll grant him that one point. Mr. Caption then links this point to the fact the Brotherhood didn't have the best power armor ever. It's a good point. So I'll just say that this sort of seems like a hand-me-down power armor situation. On the Enclave, it's because the top brass gave their second-class citizens the worst power armor to use. I really don't know. Then Mr. Caption goes on to say something about the Enclave having a radio station, why they were in hiding from the Brotherhood. I really don't know if that's true or not, nor do I really care. If they were in hiding, then I will agree with him that it was a little stupid, but obviously the Enclave at this point in the story had the power to confront the Brotherhood, at least they thought they did, and the game sort of shows that. And frankly, Mr. Caption has shown himself to be a rather unreliable reviewer at this point. So take it as you wish. I did. Why should the Enclave even care about the public support of the DC Wastelanders? Is a very good point that Mr. Caption brings up. But frankly, I don't think they do. This is all speculation, of course. His is speculation, mine's speculation. Not going to go with too hard of facts here, unless it's just something I wanted to check out on. I think that the crazed AI who believed himself to be like the embodiment of all the best traits or programmed with all the best American presidents would be more likely to care about the trust of the Wastelanders for some twisted reason than the human soldiers. Then you might ask, Vincent, then why did the human soldiers follow the crazed AI? Well, if the crazed AI is housing you and giving you cool new toys, you'll probably play along with it until it goes rogue and you have to decommission it. Or decommissions half of your force. I don't know if this is dumb or not. This just seems to be the case in Fallout 3, depending on how you play it, I guess. From there, Mr. Caption goes off on a tangent about better plans the Enclave could have done to kill people. Again, these aren't really criticisms, just what ifs, trying to poke the bear with the criticism lens. So, why make note of it? I don't care much about trying to counter or address this point. At the end, Mr. Caption did follow up with the same points as he made with the Super Mutants and the Brotherhood of Steel. Third time's the charm, right? Again, he is right. They didn't need to be in this game, I guess. But if they didn't have any of those things, Steel Bros, Submutes, Enclave, or Vaults, then why the heck did Bethesda even bother with the IP? They could have just created a new game all on their own. And I really think that's what Mr. Caption is implying, even if he doesn't come out and say it, or maybe not even realize it himself. They would have the name but nothing else. They would have the name but nothing else. I really don't know if that would have pissed off the Interplay Obsidian fans more or less, frankly.
Okay, but beyond that, let's talk about what I don't like about the Enclave being in this game from, like, a story writing perspective, just from, like, a game development, view. Again, I want to reissue the point that Tim Kaine made earlier that I talked about, that you don't need to keep redoing stuff from these previous games. Like, this game did not need to have the Enclave and the Super Mutants and the Brotherhood of Steel. To reuse a lot of these older elements without really adding much to them.
Using them without adding too much to them? Frankly, I don't know how to respond to that. Okay, I won't argue. It really sounds like a rehash or retelling of sort of a mishmash of Fallout 1 and 2. But frankly, not adding anything to it. Even if I did take this criticism as the truth, it sort of gives me a bad impression of the first two games of the franchise, making me think they're just as 2D as sort of their game engines were. Fallout 3 has its problems, but most of those problems that Mr. Caption are pointing out gives the game some depth and weight, making it more three-dimensional, in my opinion. In Fallout 1, what's the reason I'm going after the water chip for? I guess I just need to include that in my character's backstory, according to Mr. Caption's logic. If I didn't, I might as well just dick around and say F off to all my fellow former Vault residents. The same could be applied for all the groups mentioned. I get the impression that they have no serious problems within the group. The only serious problems they have are with people outside their groups. Now I can see why some people such as Creed and the ones who recommended him to me believe Fallout 3 is just as bad as the Star Wars sequel trilogy. Maybe this is why Creed had that bit about the narrator line in the title.
The intro continues to explain the concept of vaults, and this is where things start to take a turn for the worse. In the previous games, the Ron Perlman intros were just a narration to explain some backstory to how the world reached the state we see it in, and the intro to Fallout 3 largely does the same, but makes a bit of a fatal flaw right at the end. After being a neutral voice up until this point, the narrator suddenly and blatantly lies to us about Vault 101, stating outright that Vault 101 never opened, no one ever enters, and no one ever leaves, and that you were born here. But the problem here is the inconsistency. To take an example from outside Fallout, the title crawls in Star Wars never outright blatantly lied to the audience in order to deceive them. They exist as a sort of primer to convey basic information to the viewer, so they can have a basic understanding of what is going on and why.
Making that into a problem to sort of create the link between the two things. So under this, I'm guessing Fallout 3 is The Force Awakens, Fallout 4 is The Last Jedi, and Fallout 76 is The Rise of the Skywalker, right? Is this why they harp on the world building for being so bad in Fallout 3? Because it sort of creates a link between the two? No clue, but I can see how someone can make a case for that, even if I don't completely agree. Fallout 3 is a game made close to 15 years ago now. Most of the issues that I've seen being brought up are because certain critics turn elements of the game that developers didn't think needed to be shown in the game to be understood in that certain time period. It's easy to look back and say, this game 15 years ago does not live up to current game design standards, and they are absolutely right. If this game was made now, I would have the same criticism. But 15 years ago, very few gamers actually thought about the issues that most of the criticisms are based off of. The shantification of Fallout brings up a very interesting thing, and why Fallout New Vegas works better. Works better is different than saying it's a really big problem. I've already stated my case for why farms wouldn't work in Fallout 3's setting, and that is backed up by everything I've read about it. Sure, it shouldn't be the case in the real world, but this is a video game world. And while Megaton's bomb is a bit stupid, can be justified through psychological and sociological means if you have the educational background to understand it. I have a friend, we discuss these sort of issues all the time. I only have an A in psychology, he has a bachelor's in sociology. We've come to sort of a conclusion that most of the Wastelanders are not educated enough that it's not a big problem for a majority of the Wastelanders who come to trade in Megaton. They do not have our understanding of anything. I could explain more, but it's just theory. And this is not an area that some gamers think about a lot, as it's clear in Mr. Caption's case. But I'm sure other people would think that this is just a justification. It's not a justification. It's just understanding the world through the actual world that these people live in. It is a little bit absurd, and it's definitely in there for that one quest. But it is justifiable, speaking in many different scholarly terms, but that's probably above most gamers who review things. Is there a chance that these things would be very unlikely? Absolutely. But to say it's impossible, that's just ridiculous. Not when you take into account that the immediate focus of most Wastelanders would be survival, not if that bomb will explode or not. They might actually rejoice in it, especially children of the atom. It'd be like going home in the mothership Zeta or some crap like that. But maybe I've just been thinking too hard about it. After all, these are just opinions of certain critics. I don't really care if they want to criticize things that they don't understand, but they should be prepared to be criticized themselves. I am. I'm just not a person who believes in certainties. There's likelihood of something happening, and there's an unlikelihood. Sorry for that side note, but Mr. Caption is overall right in most of the points he makes. Still, looking at what happens when Bethesda try to do their own Fallout story, totally separate from the lore and themes of Fallout 1 and 2, you get something like Fallout 4's story. I'll agree, Bethesda was playing it safe in many ways, but they were also taking a risk already by using a different environment to set some of the older factions in. They also did their best to make this a personal story. Instead of trying to save a whole vault of people that you never met, you're following in your father's footsteps to sort of get answers, or punch him in the face if you're pissed at him for just leaving after telling you nothing. This is something I've seen Fallout 3 criticized for, mainly railroading. I understand the criticism, but it does not mean that I have to agree with it. It creates a tangible emotional stake in the story for the player to follow. Now, I'm sure some people don't like the story trying to force that emotional stake on the player, but that is clearly subjective given the divide in the fandom. Mr. Caption doesn't believe that Fallout 3's main story quest has the payoff it needs, even why they were playing it safe. So they should have done something new. So they might as well have done something new, because doing a story that might be dumb is better than turning something that wasn't dumb into something dumb. I'm paraphrasing here for time and humor maybe. I would agree with that in theory, but I'm not convinced Fallout 3 made the world established in one or two dumb, so to speak. It simply tried to evolve the factions from previous games by putting them in a new environment. I would need more than just the fact that these factions are different to agree with his sentiment. I really did try to do my best to steelman the argument of both positions, and I just can't see it. Maybe it's a short sight in my analytical prowess. I'm sure there's plenty there and plenty that I need to weed out. Argue with me below, but the evidence just seems too thin to me. I've had several conversations trying to poke and prod this particular argument and really didn't help me be convinced. But maybe I wasn't talking to the right people on social media to see if my opinion was so far out there. If I'm getting Mr. Caption's position wrong here, then I'm sorry. But talking about something else that was dumb, he leads us back to the main story. Dumb was his words, not mine. There he acknowledged the game wants to give you an emotional investment with the father, and Mr. Caption just didn't. Makes sense given you would have had to create a backstory of how the character would have grown up in the vault, relate it with dear old dad, and it seemed like Mr. Caption had the all or nothing approach to his character's backstory. Seems like he didn't like Dad if he got attached to him for abandoning little Mr. Caption so very much. I must point out here, emotional investment does not have to be positive. You don't have to like the dad the game gives you. It's just the one you're stuck with. In fact, Mr. Caption gives all the reasons you should dislike him rather well. This is absolutely a valid way to actually interpret someone's relationship with the father. Hunting him down to punch him in the face for all the shit he put you through makes perfect sense to me. But that take on the father is rather subjective. You could take it another way. You could understand your father's desires, passions, what he gave up to have you in the safety of the vault, or several other different ways. Who knows what the players will imagine happening between their characters and the father in the large time skips that are in the tutorial introduction section of Fallout 3. It's all about the emotional investment you pour into your player character, and it seems Mr. Caption understands this. Moving on, Dad dies, other die, but not Colonel August because of said plot device. After that, they hurry the player character into the tunnel led by Dr. Lee, where Mr. Caption points out the problem with this escape.
We have to deal with Dad's bullshit because now the entire Jefferson Memorial is getting a little bit fuckety and we have to leave. We escape through the sewers until we're stopped by a guy who has a heart condition and needs some medicine. Now, I see what they were going for with the dude with the heart condition, right? They were supposed to make it this super tense moment where you might have to kill somebody even though you're a good character, or if you have the right stimpaks you can save him, but it doesn't work at all. Because there's no feasible timer on it, or any kind of like there's nothing to prevent you from literally going out of the sewer, going to Megaton, buying 5 stimpaks, and walking back. And I know this because it's exactly what I did. This super tense moment we're being chased down by the Enclave through the sewers and the Brotherhood is just out of our reach. We might all die if we don't get this guy moving quick enough. Hold on, let me go outside, walk to a nearby city, walk back, then we can get to the medicine, and then we can go. Just the Enclave will stop, I'll ask them, hey guys, we need to help this dude. Can you just stay back there for like 3 days? I'll be back in, just quick time. I'll be back, I swear. I really don't get why there isn't some kind of limitation placed on this quest to make it so you can't just go and restock your fucking stimpaks.
Here, I'll accept that this is a problem with the game. Sure, you can convince the dear doctor to leave him behind, but it's still an issue with the main story if you can't, and you don't have the stimpaks on you to heal the down NPC, who's a rather hard block to the main story quest. Mr. Caption skips the Brotherhood Citadel to talk about the gameplay, and he goes into the shooting mechanics first. Here, Mr. Caption brings up some rather good points. How the shooting mechanic relates to the points you put into it. Spread, damage, distance, all that fun stuff. This seems like the whole adaptation element going from CRPG to first-person RPG / third-person if you want to take that approach. I don't care much for his argument that points shouldn't affect the accuracy, but that's what fits the story's narrative. You can make a case why this wouldn't affect the courier from Fallout New Vegas as much. The courier would definitely had much more experience in the field with guns, at least in theory, than the lone wanderer who came out fresh-faced from the vault. No experience required, besides the silly training with rad roaches in the target and a BB gun. Mr. Caption also talks about the melee combat. Nothing too wrong with this. I never really did melee in Fallout 3. So yeah, a weakness in mine. I can't criticize or agree with him here, so I'll assume he's right on these points. I am sort of disappointed he doesn't talk at all about the VAT system here, but it seems like it's a resource that he didn't use a lot, judging from the gameplay and what he talks about. And that seems like a shame, since it really is part of the game that sets it apart from other games like this. And that seems like a shame. After a small section about the companions that really isn't worth mentioning or playing, Mr. Caption returns to his visit of the Brotherhood Citadel. Here he brushes over the story and power armor training to reach the scribe you must talk to move the story along, and to locate a Gek. He presses X to doubt that the scribe is doubtful of the existence of the Gek. This seems like a minor point, but I don't know how Fallout 2 comes in play here. He makes it seem like something the Brotherhood would know about. Sure, there's a quest for the Gek, but from everything I've read to verify this piece of criticism, the Brotherhood really wasn't involved in that from what I know. Then Mr. Caption gets the little lamplight, and frankly, this is the only element that I've come across that I will not even attempt to steal man. It can be done, but there really are so many problems with it that you have to stretch the logic beyond what I'm comfortable with doing with to sort of defend this sort of mini Lord of the Flies-esque area of Fallout 3. It is a spectacle. And it is cool in theory, but very not practical logically. So, instead of saying anything about it, here's his thoughts that I can somewhat get behind.
Seriously, why are these little kids right out here? Oh, the rule of cool? Is that why? Is that what we're doing? The rule of cool states that a bunch of children have to have a small, stupid-ass society where they get rid of all the useful adults in their groups and exile them and live near super mutants for no good fucking reason? Seriously, why do these kids, like, get rid of adults? The adults are, like, infinitely more useful. Why don't the adults just, like, overthrow the little kids? Also, these gates operate by having functioning motorcycles, like, lift the gates up. Why don't the kids or the adults just, like, steal the motorcycles or something like that? How did these kids build all of this exactly? Like, how did they lift a motorcycle into the cave and then, like, suspend it by a couple of ropes over onto their gate? Yeah, I'm gonna stop asking questions. It's the only way I'm gonna survive Fallout 3. So basically, this dumbass kid tells us that we can't enter Little Lamplight because it's for kids only, and you deal with him in one of a variety of ways. You can either talk to him or do what I do, open up the console and disable him and the gate.
Goes over to Vault 87, meet Fox, get the Gek, then the Enclave, yay! Shortened version of that. Mr. Caption then goes over the stupidity of the Enclave, which in many ways also I can sort of get behind.
Besides that, the best way for us to do that is not with an armed convoy of soldiers taking us while we're still handcuffed. No, it's to give us all of our guns back and then to let us run free through their base, but just tell the soldiers not to shoot us. Even though, you know, the player might have, like, power armor and laser rifles or laser Gatling guns or bombs or something incredibly dangerous that could dismantle part of the Enclave's mission here. Or, you know, like a radio that might tell the Brotherhood of Steel where they are, or something like that, you know. Then again, that would be stupid, because then we couldn't have the Colonel turn on the President and tell all the soldiers to shoot us and then have an epic dungeon where we go and we kill a bunch of Enclave soldiers. God forbid we do something thematic that we haven't already done. I mean, seriously, the player just spent an entire, like, 10 minutes in a dungeon of small corridors fighting people with a lot of health. Why would you then make them go through the exact same thing but with people with a lot of armor? After we fight through 40 leagues of crap in the Enclave base, we eventually make it to President Eden, and surprise, surprise, he's a computer, yeah, well, super plot does whatever. President Eden decides it would be a good idea that after everything the Enclave has done to us, he thinks that he is going to place his trust in us to continue his mission. Basically, President Eden goes up to us and says, oh, hey, do you want to, like, do what the Enclave was doing, even though, you know, what we're doing runs completely against everything you've done up until this point?
You really need to put some thought on it and some spin in your brain to get it to make sense. It has logic behind it, but more video game logic than anything else. Them giving you back all your gear might seem like a minor risk in their judgment, you know, being pretty much elitist, best of humanity, and human supremacists and all that stuff, but none of that's really worth defending in story or game terms too much. This is one of these issues that I can see people taken issue with, so to speak. I could steel man it. I could even do it without the brain-breaking logic of trying to support little lamplight children town thing, but I really don't care enough to. Yes, Eden is a crazy, possibly stupid AI who makes very little sense. But I'm probably more used to crazy AIs doing things that might not make a whole lot of sense to human beings while possibly making computer sense. But I see Eden as something like HAL 9000 in Fallout 3. HAL 9000, in case you're too young to understand, is the crazy robot from 2001. Look it up. So I will personally accept this, since I am sure I could be a slightly better conversational partner than Deep Blue, but I doubt I could beat him in a chess game. Probably a bad comparison, but I had fun in making it, and sort of hoping to earn some geek cred with that. Probably not, probably too dated, like most of my comments. But the point I'm trying to make is that I doubt I could or want to understand the logic of a computer AI of the Fallout universe. After that, Mr. Caption goes after NBit. Not much can really be spied from this that I really care to highlight, but this certain section.
Still need to activate Liberty Prime and send the Pride in to stop the Enclave, because they're gonna make water, I guess. I don't fucking know. So we activate Liberty Prime, who actually has, like, a good reason to be in this game, because he's actually, like, a tactical advantage and not just a fucking cutscene. And we go and we storm the Jefferson Memorial for the final battle. We walk out of the Citadel to see an initially pretty interesting scene where, like, a couple of vertibirds are fighting off Liberty Prime, but, like, two of them leave, and then there's like also mortar shells going off, but after a few seconds this whole thing kind of becomes really boring. It's kind of hard to ignore that like there's only 3 vertibirds and 2 of them have already left, and there's just like Liberty Prime and there's only like 4 mortar shells going off at any given time, so it's basically the equivalent of 4 assholes with mortars, 5 Brotherhood of Steel soldiers, and a robot. I kind of blame Bethesda for the lack of any good scale in this moment, sort of. I mean, it's not their fault that the engine just can't handle a lot of NPCs and shit going on all at once, but it is kind of their fault for using the engine knowing that it can't do that. Luckily, Fallout 4's upgrades seem to have made this a little bit better. I mean, hopefully one day they'll just redo the engine and make it so that having like 50 on 50 battles is like possible, but until then, they did what they could. We fight with Liberty Prime on our way towards the Jefferson Memorial up until the very last big, like, energy field, force field thing that the Enclave has, where Liberty Prime stops because, he can't fit in the Jefferson Memorial, he's too big. So the player character in the Lion's Pride have to storm the Jefferson Memorial all alone.
Okay, that's good to know. The game engine sucks. I knew that already. For multiple different of reasons, so that is illuminated. Mr. Caption gives some commentary leading up to the grand in-battle scene, which anyone should know about. I'm getting to the part of the video where I'm just gonna have to review Mr. Caption's closing statements on his critique. So I'm gonna have to play as much of it as possible, which I really have been avoiding so far as much as possible, and just respond.
But we're almost at the end, so I can't back out now, right? So, Fallout 3 is not a very good Fallout game. We've all kind of come to that conclusion, and a lot of people agree with me on that point. I've made my arguments on why it's not a good Fallout game, and I've basically said my case here. It's been like an hour and 45 minutes.
And I've made my points over the current, 12-page script, probably with some ad-libbing like this. And I can't agree or disagree if Fallout 3 is a good Fallout game or not. But I can say it's definitely above average game to a good game for the time it was made in that culture. At this time, I can assess that it's a game with some problems that make it age very poorly without the aid of DLCs and modders.
But actually, I don't entirely hate Fallout 3. Like, I don't think that Fallout 3 is the worst Fallout game that could have ever been made. It was just sort of a misguided one made by people who didn't really know what they were working with because it was like their first time doing it and they didn't really have the like insider knowledge on what makes this universe tick. It's kind of like what Dark Souls 2 is to the Dark Souls franchise. It just didn't have the original people or enough of the original people or whatever, and it just wasn't as good as the other one.
Ouch, that was painful. Well, besides a few points, I really don't know if I agree with the evidence that led him to this conclusion here. This is his subjective opinion and all. Why, I'm trying to come to a more objective opinion based on researching the claims Mr. Caption had made in this video. and frankly finding some flaws that would lead to his opinions being a little bit off.
But it's still pretty decent, right? Like, say what you will about Fallout 3, it's not the worst thing that's ever happened to Fallout. Fallout Brotherhood of Steel is, and if you don't know what that is, go look that one up.
I'm not sure if the original people who were still around at Interplay could have done much better. Yeah, Van Buren, or whatever it was called, the game that could have been but wasn't, will always be legendary in the Interplay Fallout fans' mind. Problem with that is what could have been tends not to be close to reality.
Like, at the end of the day, Fallout 3 is still an RPG. It still has stuff that makes Fallout Fallout, even if sometimes it's a little misguided in what it knows what Fallout is. The story isn't very good, there's not very good karma, you basically can only do, like, one fucking faction in the game. The side quests and exploration, however, are kind of where the main bulk of the game is, and those are at least decent enough. Like, Fallout 3 has more or less all the elements that made the previous Fallout games Fallout and made them good, but they just don't work as well in Fallout 3 because they weren't thought out as much. Fallout 3 probably would have been a lot better if they cared about how their world worked and cared about less about, like the rule of cool instead of, me caring about how things function in this world and making sense and making things memorable without some kind of big explosion.
Well, I can't totally agree with that. Of course, I push back on some of the claims that Mr. Caption made. I really think that Bethesda did think about how the world worked. They might have not executed the way that people wanted them to, but that's besides the point. There's many elements, such as the crappy-ass game engine they used, not be able to provide the rain effects to easily support the fact that plants you see in the game are dead or not. They also probably didn't care too much about the rain effects, since it would sort of defeat the purpose of having the purified water as a driving force for much of the game's plot, but that's just guesswork on my behalf. You can also work that into the rule of cool, but it is a video game. But I will hands down admit that is what certain elements of the game, especially Little Lamplight, was most likely the case of, the rule of cool. Also, it served as a rather hard block if you didn't have a high enough speech or perk to talk your way inside, and you got to skip 2 side quests, main quest things if you had a high enough speech, so this is the 3rd time and they just made it hard with the unlikely town of kids. Theoretically possible, but so close to zero that anyone who thought about it for too long might pop a brain vessel.
I mean, that's what made the first 2 games really cool, is that it has like a lot of just player freedom, and the stories make sense and the characters function in decent ways, even though there are a lot of colorful, nonsensical characters to kind of counterbalance that. And Fallout 3 has a lot of cracky, kooky, whatever the word is, wacky I think is what I was going for, characters to counterbalance the serious stuff, but the serious stuff is where it all kinds of falls apart. Nobody in this game is making sensible decisions, the ecosystem fucking doesn't even work, nothing about this game makes any sense. But at the end of the day, in my opinion, you can at least boot it on, stop thinking about it, and still enjoy a Fallout game. Not a good one, but a Fallout game. One with some amount of player freedom that actually catalogs what you do and has the world react to the stuff you're going around and doing in at least some way. One with lots of quests and lots of characters to meet and lots of good stuff to do and lots of player freedom where you can go around and just do whatever the hell you want. And one with some decent, not great, but fun stories to tell. It's far from how bad I think Fallout 4 is for the franchise, because Fallout 4 shows that they literally just took out a shit ton of RPG elements and give you a big open world with a lot of enemies to shoot and a lot of quests, with some serious air quotes on that one, to do, but no actual, substance to any of this. Fallout 3 is a big open-ended RPG set in the post-apocalypse, whereas Fallout 4 is a big open sandbox game where you go around shooting mutants for 3 hours before you turn off the game.
Okay, only let that go on that long to state that I agree with Mr. Caption's assessment on Fallout 4. And he did give Fallout 3 a passable grade. I still think he did not think deeply enough on some of the issues that he is regarding as problems, but I also probably focus more on the actual story of Fallout 3 rather than the game side of things. I've said before, we all have our bias and our blind spots. I've already gone over why I believe the changes made to the Brotherhood of Steel and the Super Mutants are perfectly valid growths. I'm a little iffier on the Enclave. I can see both sides of the arguments on that one faction. Mr. Caption goes on to talk about Fallout New Vegas, making a case for why it is better. I agree with the opinion New Vegas is better overall than Fallout 3, but I also think Fallout 3 has some elements that are lost in New Vegas, and also don't feel as harshly towards Fallout 3 as a game due to not seeing the same flaws in the game as most critics. The thing is, Fallout 3, judging just the story, is much easier to critique than the game design from 15 years ago from our modern day standards of video games, and it seems rather unfair to apply these standards on this old of a game. I have admitted there are problems with Fallout 3, but the engine, I will say, wasn't the best, but there were strides being made in this era to bring us to modern day game standards. So far, I haven't seen any apparent problems with the world design of Fallout 3 that can't be explained by the limits of the game engine or details the developer probably did not think needed to be included in the game, because there was evidence of how the way the world worked if you look through certain dialogue and lore long enough. I've already stated the world of Fallout 3 was meant not to be farmable, so that piece of criticism, people wanting farming, you'll get your answer to why it can't happen in Rivet City if you look deeply enough into that.
There's only one real farm, if you want to call it that, and it is found at Rivet City of all places. It is kind of ironic that the only settlement that is actually growing things is on a giant steel ship. Anyway, Dr. Lee is conducting research into hydroponics, and as a result, there's a rather substantial hydroponic farm at Rivet City. It grows enough produce that Rivet City is able to trade the produce to traders and surrounding settlements. No other settlement is seen growing produce. Even old derelict farms and farmsteads are not seen with wastelanders attempting to grow produce. That has not always been the case, however. At an unmarked location, simply referred to as the Hilltop Farm Ruins, there is a terminal that records the attempts of a group of Great War survivors. They came to the farm to grow crops and raise animals with mixed results. Using irrigation techniques, they record seeing some crops grow and remark how all the goats and chickens die, but the cattle seem to be doing pretty fine. No other mention is made of the success or failure of the crops, as the survivors were killed or perhaps driven off by a group of people that noticed their presence.
While some critics might say hiding lore and story elements from the player is a bad thing on its own, I don't agree. Now, if someone wanted to have a debate about that, that would be fine. It would be my opinion versus their opinion on that point until we could nail down certain elements that could sway my opinion one way or their opinion another. This seems to be a game design philosophy that very few studios have braced over the years, even now. Again, it's not a bad thing on its own. Saying that would be a logical fallacy, which I will probably be getting much more heavily into in the next video. And I gave Mr. Caption a pass on pulling any of those out in this video, since I felt that would be the fairest way to go over his video. Try to speak the most honestly I could, because I believe he spoke the most honestly he could. But from my research, it seemed like only two big game studios that does not focus on horror games include this sort of hidden, uncovering lore world building in their games. One is From Software, creator of the Soulborn series, along with a lot of other things, and the other is Bethesda. Why, I will acknowledge my shortcomings for this analysis. I try to do enough research to compensate for that and take other people's opinions in account. Especially since Creed is the one I'm going up against. Gotta train like Rocky. But at least I'm not against Apollo Creed. 8-hour video is gonna be a tough thing to take on, but personally, I don't think I need to attack or defend every point being made. Look for the critical points, don't skip anything that's important, and go for my jabs there. Simply put, if there's a linchpin linchpin argument or criticism that other arguments or criticism are built around, as long as you take out that initial linchpin argument or criticism, everything built around them falls apart. I believe that to be the case with What Do They Eat? A criticism that unfortunately I think might have come from either Mr. Caption or Mr. B Tongue for the attack on the world building. If there are plants growing, even if they aren't trees, just some grass and maybe some bushes, the food chain argument falls apart and everything built upon it. But of course, Bethesda doesn't make it that easy. It shrouds the game in mystery because frankly, that seems to be the trope that Bethesda was using on this game, and it makes defending it hard as hell when you have to find little pieces and try to defend it. I will say, like Mr. B Tongue said in the shadification of Fallout, it's a lot clearer in New Vegas what the people are eating. But even in that game, they did not have rain and they did not have perfect mechanics to show people picking the food from the vine. That would be a nitpick that I would not actually want to use in a real argument, but this is my conclusion of this video. And that argument isn't even what makes New Vegas a better game than Fallout 3. It's more the shadification of the quest lines that does that. Yet Fallout 3 has its own strength. A lot of design decisions that make it hard to defend against the criticism also makes it a lot more creepy and mysterious and horror-like compared to any of the other Fallout games. If people want to criticize the game for having that horror element, that's fine. I don't think that's a criticism. That seems to be a strength of Fallout 3 that New Vegas did pick up elements of. Why I'm coming to a greater understanding of the concerns that a lot of critics of Fallout 3 have for the game, and probably a whole lot of other games that are built around this highly praised media machine that I don't even agree with. Still, the people who scrutinize these games to the level of detail that's done seems to be going for total immersion in a game, or at least as close as they can get to it. And I understand that concern, but it is concerning, and I've been thinking on that in this process. But I think a little bit outside the game, as well as try to think a little bit deeper in the game. So for now, I'm done.